So again, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to talk today about sustainability. I've got a slide deck already. Before we do that, though, let's talk about the case study number two a little bit. Your reviews are due today. Many of you are have logged on and seen that you only have one review shown there, and enough of you have been confused that I've gotten this message from a lot of you. Do your first review, and then another one will be assigned, and then another one will be assigned. The reason the system does this is because that way they can adapt as additional people submit, so that you're it's not fixed such that the first person gets two, three, and four, the second person gets three, four, and five, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because then at a certain point, the system would have to say, okay, now it's done, it's absolutely done for sure, and wrap it back around, and then the first person to go would not get reviewed as quickly or something like that. So the this way the system doesn't have to know in advance how many submissions there are going to be, and it can just assign one and then two and then three. If you keep going, I think you can keep going. So I had one person reviewed three and said, "Can I do four?" It shows, do I have to do four? I've already done it. I said, "No, you've already done your three. Go ahead and stop." Although I'm tempted to ask you to do number four and see if it assigns you a fifth, but don't. I was being silly. His reply was, "Can't stop, won't stop," with a smile emoji, thankfully. So he also thought it was funny. But the we should be in a position where everyone's getting pretty good feedback. I've seen some of the feedback folks are giving. I've seen some of the feedback folks are getting. Admittedly, this is among the set who've done their feedback relatively early, so I'd hope that set, at least that subpopulation of students, would be giving pretty good feedback. But I expect that of all of you. Make sure you give 15-20 minutes per paper to sit down and really give it a good read through and give some good feedback, and some good thoughtful scoring. I will inflate the grades a good bit, just because I'm trying to make this class as unstressful as possible. And since the variations to which people said, "Oh, it's a draft," to I'm really going to try my hardest so that I can get the best feedback possible. Obviously, the latter is a better idea, but if folks really did something that's a good faith effort at a draft but still looks a lot like a draft, like, I'm not going to grade it like as harshly as I did on the first one. And I was still, I think, reasonably generous with the first one. So not most people are still not going to get 80s, but something like half of the gap between 80 and what you would get is roughly the way I'll be grading, so that you should be generally pretty happy with your grade. But evaluate each other fairly, right? Don't say, like I said, most folks should be getting A's or B's. There should be some C's, almost all C's or above. But don't use that whole range, even though I'm mostly not going to use that whole range yourself, just so your peers know roughly how far they have to improve before they can get it. Because I'm going to grade the last one normally, and you want folks to set folks up such that they're ready to succeed on that. Any other questions about the second case study or the process around it?
So I have a quick question. The review feedback is due tonight, right?
Yes, due tonight at midnight.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yes. Anything else?
One more question. So whatever score we got on the case study, that is the final score for this case study too?
So you're gonna get for what you've submitted right now, you're gonna get up to 80 points on this draft of the case study, and so it's not. But that's not going to be your final score for the final version. For the final version, there's another 50 points out there for you to go get. So you have to make those revisions to get that to the point where it's really highly polished, and that's where that grading is going to be a lot more variable. So what you've submitted for your case study number two should get you close to 80 points. I'm going to grade pretty generously on that. And then you'll get another 30 points for doing your peer reviews, and you get another up to 50 points for doing your doing the final version of case study number two. Does that answer your question?
So you know what I mean? So when I scored the people who wrote their case study, if I scored them, for example, 70 points, is that their total grade for
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, no. So,
Okay.
yeah, no, don't worry about like, oh, I'm gonna wreck this person's grade. Like, just give them good, honest feedback, and I'm gonna score them more generously than you should.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was nervous about that. Thank you.
Yeah. No, good question. Good question. No. There won't be a lot of 80s, but there's going to be a lot of A's. There's going to be a lot of A's on this paper, and some, good number of B's of folks who otherwise would get C's. So I'm gonna grade pretty generously on this second round here, and try to get through them pretty quickly too, because I really am counting on you all to give each other better feedback as a group of three, as a team of three, than I could do as an individual. So. Um, any other questions? Pretty good. Okay, it's officially hot tea season again. Was not ready for that, but got my tea all ready here. Um, Started to lose my voice in the last lecture. Hopefully that doesn't happen this time. Let's we're recording, share screen, desktop 2. Need the sound as well. So today we're gonna cover chapter 12, sustainability. That's gonna get you what this lecture today is gonna get you is what I think is a really important takeaway from this discussion. It is not at all a comprehensive coverage of the chapter, but the just some other terms and concepts that I think are related, and then that's going to include a deep dive into global warming / climate change. So before we get there, just a brief discussion of terminology. Corporate social responsibility and environmental, social, and governance is what ESG stands for. I'll talk about what that is and the good news about why we're doing that. And then we're going to talk about climate change in detail. I'll talk a little bit about why I'm covering that in detail, even though it's in the book and even though it's something most of you have some familiarity with. I just think it's really important. And then some of the relevant concepts that this stuff brings up. I have one of these relevant concepts at the beginning of the climate change discussion, but then after that, I think there's a bunch of relevant concepts that come into environmental issues, and these are really not in the textbook, and I think they're worth covering. And then finally, we're at least going to get started on this Planet Money episode. For those of you who looked ahead a little bit, for the discussion that we're going to have on Wednesday, it's going to be based around this Planet Money episode around the recyclability of plastics or lack thereof, right? It's not that there's a problem with not really being able to recycle plastics. And so how did we get to this point, and what does that look like? We'll probably not have enough time to do the whole 24-minute episode, but we'll at least get it started, and then I'll let you finish on your own. The link is already available on Canvas, but I'll also throw it in the chat in the Zoom at the end as well, just to get you started in case you want to just continue the momentum. So there's one phrase that we've used all semester that is in the title of the class, which is corporate social responsibility, or CSR. Right, and we've talked about that a lot and what that entails. But that's kind of an amorphous term that could mean a lot of things, or could mean a whole bunch of different things, and it really does mean a whole bunch of different things. And the term of art that a lot of people in industry use actually is not CSR. If you say CSR, they're going to know what you're speaking about. Just like if you say stocks in your, if you go to become a financial analyst at a bank, and you're like, oh, we should invest in stocks, that people aren't going to be like, oh, what's a stock? Like, they know what a stock is. But for those of you who are finance majors, what term should you actually use to indicate that you're hip and one of the finance people that really understands their language?
Securities.
Securities. Okay, that's a slightly broader category of terms. Slightly more specific. Anybody know this? I know we don't have a whole lot of finance majors here. The answer is equities. And so you would want to say, so securities includes equities, but that would also include bonds, futures, those sorts of things. So equities specifically are shares of companies that we would call stocks. So if you're going into finance, or you're going into a discussion with finance people, and you want to sound hip, you want to sound like you're part of the club, use the word equities, not stocks. Similarly, CSR is a term of art. It's a little bit less drastic than that. It's not quite as tenured to say CSR, but if you want to sound like you're really hip and part of the conversation, I recommend you use ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. environmental, social, and governance issues for a company. And the thing I like about ESG versus CSR is that ESG is much more specific. It's a set of things that you look at that you can measure that are really clear. And it's like, these things are what we're measuring with the company. So what are the company's environmental impacts? What are its social impacts? And what is the company's governance structure? And how does that set it up to prevent ethical and other harms that are foisted upon stakeholders and the broader society? So if we were in a so I'll start with social. Social is the bulk of what we've done to this point. We've looked at sort of what are the relationships with stakeholders, such as employees, the external community, stockholders, what are the relationships with suppliers, those sorts of things. So the bulk of what we've talked about would fall under the social realm. What are the social impacts of the company? This also obviously would include corporate philanthropy, strategic investment, these sorts of things where a company is trying to have a more positive impact on society. All of that would go under the S for social. Environmental, that's what this chapter is all about. I'm kind of surprised the book only has one chapter on it, but this obviously is another really huge area that companies are interested in. And when companies talk about doing well, that affirmatively choose sort of what investment they're going to make in their brand in terms of talking about like, we're a good company, the environmental message is a really huge part of that. So for instance, Starbucks, just apropos of nothing, in one of my podcasts, I'm a huge podcast fan, as you've probably gathered by this point. One of the podcasts I listened to, that apropos of nothing, that they had Starbucks pop in and just talk about how great they are for donating coffee tree seeds to farmers in the parts of the world that grow a lot of coffee, and donating a diverse set of coffee tree seeds so that those trees are resistant to pests, resistant to drought, and so on, and grow a lot better in the sort of changing climate that we have. That sort of environmental investment is a huge part of what companies are doing to try to increase their brand equity in all the ways that we talked about earlier in the semester, that give them that sort of like warm, fuzzy glow to make you want to give them more of your money. The last one, governance. This really is a big deal among corporate leadership, but it's one that we haven't talked about in a whole lot of detail to this point. I mean, we've talked about, sort of leadership and culture and a lot of the stuff that matters all the way from like the top to the bottom of the company. But and that's some of what they mean by governance. But a lot of it is just sort of like the ethical angle on a lot of the same stuff you're learning in just like Management 3000, for instance. But by governance specifically, we mean there's a lot of, I've got a, yeah, here. So here's a book on corporate governance, right? Trust, Accountability, and Purpose. It's by Justin O'Brien, right? So like, this is an example of when we talk about corporate governance, we're talking about what this book's specifically about. And when we talk about corporate governance generally, we're talking about sort of what is the C-suite, what is the board have in place so that they know for sure that the C-suite is doing what those people say that they're going to do. What do the C-suite and the board together have combined to make sure that management is doing what they think what they know they're going to do? How do we set up systems so that we have trust and accountability, verifiable audits, internal and external, audits of other sorts of results, right? So how do we make sure not only that the finances are right, but that the sales numbers are accurate, and that the environmental numbers are accurate, and that the social impact numbers are accurate? So all these if this were an MBA class, we would be 2, 3, 4 weeks of it. We would be talking in a lot more detail about governance structure, corporate governance mechanisms. But a lot of that is just really deep in the weeds. That's not as important to folks who, such as yourselves, who almost to a person are going to have more sort of like first, second, third rung in the corporate ladder kind of jobs when you come out of graduation. So by all means, go get those jobs, and then move up another rung, and then move up another rung, and become those kinds of alumni that are really accomplished and have lots of cool stuff to talk about, and then come back and be a guest speaker. And then by all means, come to our softball and basketball games, and our volleyball games, and our soccer games, and become a donor and get engaged, and all of those things that we want you to do as alumni. That once you're sort of more at that point in your career, and you've got 5-10 years of experience under your belt, and you're like, oh, I kind of want to brush up, maybe set myself up more to shoot for a little bit higher on the corporate hierarchy, then come back to us, come get an MBA, and then we'll talk more about corporate governance. That's more the sort of the type of audience that we're talking about there, is folks who are going to be more at the level where you're flipping specific switches about how to run those things. The stuff I try to focus on with you all has been more sort of the kinds of things where it's like you're a frontline supervisor, or maybe you're the next step above that. What kinds of decisions and ethical conundra, or even just as a frontline employee, what sort of ethical conundrums are you going to face? Like that to me, that angle of business ethics is a little bit more real for what most people are going to have to deal with in the workplace. Anyway, so the reason I bring this up is because you're going to have somebody joining us probably almost certainly on the 21st, a VP who is focused on this stuff at a company. I'm not going to name them because they have not yet cleared it with their communications team. But we're going to have another guest speaker come in, and this person is very much focused on exactly the type of stuff we've been talking about this semester. And the term that they're going to use is probably going to be more ESG instead of CSR. So I want you to go out knowing this stuff, but I also want you not to sort of be jarred when we have a guest speaker come in and do that. So it was just a good reminder for me when I talked to her last week that folks in the corporate world are a little bit more likely to choose this latter lingo. So now let's talk about climate change. Now the book talks about a whole bunch of different ecological problems. It's sort of a very quick cursory overview of a whole bunch of the different things, the different reasons that we have for concern about how, companies, humans generally, but companies specifically can be having negative impacts upon the environment. I really want to focus in on climate change and drill down and cover more than what the book says, and provide just some really good visual illustrations of some of what the book is talking about for a couple of reasons. First is that I have a real passion for this topic because I think there is no more substantial threat to humankind as we know it. Now, the idea that we're gonna have so much climate change in the earth that humans will go extinct is probably unlikely. I mean, we're a hardy species, we're a resilient species, but that we're going to have a planet that can continue to sustain 8 billion of us going for 1,000 years at the rate we're going is pretty hard to imagine. So we're likely facing a substantial series of economic and environmental cataclysms and I'm not exaggerating when I use a term like cataclysm, unless we make serious and substantial changes about the way that humans are behaving. And so I think that's important to talk about. And so, what soil pollution, air pollution, all that other stuff, the smog and so on, like those all matter too. I'm not saying that they don't, they certainly do. But, like a mine or a factory or something that has a local effect, that's nothing like the sort of planetary scale stuff that we're seeing around climate change. And so I think that's important. The other reason I want to talk about climate change in detail is because there's a lot of motivated reasoning happening around climate change. Now, a lot of folks, they hear about climate change and they're like la 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 la. Right. And they're not literally doing that, but what they are doing is they're saying, I'm going to latch on to these disagreements about, between this scientist and this scientist about whether it's, 100 years or 150 years before such and such happens, or whether it's, 2 degrees or 3 degrees Celsius that we can sustain before we really start to see these problems, or, whether sea levels are going to rise by 10 meters or 20 meters, right? There continue to be substantial scientific disagreements between people, between experts about what the evidence is, what the evidence means, where it is that we're headed. There is, and let me be extremely clear about this, there is no serious disagreement among serious, credible scientists about whether climate change is real, There is no serious, credible disagreement between serious, credible scientists about whether climate change is caused by humans. They're absolutely in lockstep consensus about this in a way that is very difficult to overstate. That is very difficult to overstate. And so if you are inclined to put your, and I'm not going to ask for anyone to raise a hand like, oh, I'm a bit of a skeptic, or, oh, I'm not so sure. Oh, I'm I want to continue to drive my, F-350. And so I'm not that, I just don't want to think about the impacts of climate change there. That's fine. That's fine. I get it. I understand this is not a fun topic. This is not something, I try to think about this as little as possible as well, because it's not, I don't like it. It's uncomfortable to think about this. And I get that discomfort is something that people don't like to confront, right? Confronting uncomfortable truths is very few people's strong suit. But I don't want that motivated reasoning to be confused with the truth, because the truth is absolutely what I'm going to share with you, to the best of what 99% plus of credible scientists on this issue have come to conclude. Now, I happen to have had a bit of an experience with some of the sources of evidence that we have about climate change just the other day. This is something that you can see. You can see this enormous warehouse on the way out west on Alameda. If you've ever taken Alameda out towards Green Mountain, I love trail running. I've just gotten into it. I'm not like, this season is really my first time trying to become a trail runner. The COVID is actually the reason I became a runner, because I couldn't go to the gym. So I was like, well, I want to do something. And so I'm one of those annoying people who actually picked up a hobby during the pandemic. And the hobby that I picked up is running. And my partner is a very, very serious runner. I mean, she broke her tib fib last February, right? So she was in lockdown before it was cool. She already is back up running sort of like, miles in the 7s, as many as you got. So she'll go run 10 miles, like sub 8 minutes each, like boom, boom, boom. So she's fast. She's really quick. She's a really serious runner. So she's dragging me out all over God's green earth, and I'm going running with her. It's a lot of fun. On the way out to Green Mountain over the weekend, I finally looked at what this warehouse is. We've driven past it a number of times, and this is what you can see here is like 1/20th of one side of it. And so it's like 20 or like 15 or 20 of these like arch things. And then like each one is clearly something like 2 or 3 or 4 football fields long going the other direction as well. So it's just this enormous, enormous warehouse. And I finally looked up and said, what is that? And it turns out that it is the National Science Foundation Ice Core facility. Right. And so for those of you who don't immediately know what that means, it means this, right? It's a giant freezer that keeps, all of these tubes of ice that they've taken out of the ice shelf in Antarctica in particular, some out of the Arctic as well, I'm sure, in Greenland and such. Right. And what they can do with that is they can effectively go back in time. And they can say, what was the atmosphere like? What was the climate like? What were the other particles in the air? That sort of thing. And so, scientists like this, do not envy this job. I'm chilly in my basement. It's got to be 64 here, right? But you can go back with the, sort of marking back how far back you go, and then using I'm sure all sorts of cool technologies. I'm sure it's like spectrometers and stuff, so I don't have to cut the ice and do. I'm sure they do that and do chemical analyses as well, but mostly trying to keep it intact. Can tell you all sorts of cool stuff about what the Earth used to be like tens and even hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so using this science as well as all sorts of other kinds of sciences that my knowledge it only scratches, and I know lots of professional scientists, way more than most people will ever meet. As an academic, you meet other academics, and a lot of them are doing stuff like this, right? And even then, my knowledge only scratches the surface of this stuff. But these people have collectively told us a lot about what the Earth used to look like as far back as, say, 800,000 years ago. And this is carbon dioxide. This is a graph showing you carbon dioxide in parts per million. That's the y-axis. And then the x-axis is how far into the past does this go. So 200,000, 400,000, 600,000, 800,000 years before today. right? And so, from about 160, 170, 170 parts per million carbon dioxide, that's, each of those dips like that is an ice age where the world would have been really pretty frozen, because carbon dioxide is a heat trapping gas. And so when there's less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to trap that heat, the more of the heat escapes. The sun, it doesn't hold the heat from the sun, and we get an ice age. And then when the CO2 goes up, that's when the Earth gets warmer, and so the end of an ice age, right? So this is the most recent ice age that we had, and then the end of that ice age is this spike in CO2 that we have right here. And so that range, you'll notice that range, like I said, goes from about, I don't know, something like 170 as high as 300 parts per million, and even then only once in the last 800,000 years. And for the most part, it stayed in this tight band of about 160, 170 up to about 280 parts per million of CO2. Until, that is, of course, right now. And this is a vertical line. In the context of geologic time, all of recorded human history, let alone all of industrial history, is a blip, is a blink in the eye, So in 150 years, we've gone from, on the warm end by, geologically historical scales up, through the ceiling and rocketing northward. So we have, by 2019, we had 409.8, 410 parts per million of carbon dioxide. We'd never had more than 300 before, and now we're over 400. We had never in the last 800,000 years had more than 300 parts per million carbon dioxide. We are now over 400, headed towards 500 pretty quickly, actually. I'll talk about that in a sec, namely right now. So the lowest case scenario for 2100, just the end of the century. Many of you will live to see 2100. I probably won't be so lucky, but many of you will live to see 2100. And the lowest case scenario for that is still substantially higher than it is today. 430, 420, 430, 440. If we stop there, we are incredibly lucky. You and our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren are incredibly lucky if we can stop it in the 400s. The higher end scenario has us closer to 1,000 parts per million by 2100. And again, the historical range one time exceeded, 280 or so, got up to 300. And we're headed for 800, 900, 1,000 if we don't intervene substantially. This is an existential threat to everything that we think about the global economy, as well as the mix of species that can even survive on this planet, as well as the long-term sustainability of the majority of the people on this planet. I hate to put it that way, but I'm not exaggerating. So clearly, just the shape of this graph alone should say, okay, well, yeah, that's human created. There's no way, there's nothing in this previous history that could possibly explain, that's possibly at all consistent with this, except for the existence of an industrialized human species. But in case you weren't yet convinced enough, here is an almost lockstep graph. So the blue line is carbon dioxide emissions in billions of tons by humans. Right, 1750. So when the Declaration of Independence is being signed, when our Constitution is being developed, not the same things. You should know this. Even up through, just before the Civil War, almost nothing. Yeah, we're burning wood. We're burning a little bit of coal. It's hard to get out of the earth. So our emissions in terms of CO2 are very, very slow. It does look like it's having an effect. Changes like this rapid in such a, again, shrink this back down to the scale of 800,000 years, and this is going to look like a right, but it's going to be just a much shorter little spike. So even the stuff that we're doing as we're starting to industrialize is already starting to have an effect. But then by the 20th century, it's just, off the charts. So, the CO2 emissions by billions of tons is just, up to where it's, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, pushing towards 40 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year. And then, little surprise, the atmospheric CO2 in parts per million is also going up correspondingly. So just boom, 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 boom. And so the more we emit, the more carbon we have caught in the atmosphere. And I assume most of you know what this means, but I'm just going to be super explicit. It means that we're going to have a much warmer planet. It means we're going to have, and we already have a substantially warmer planet. The warmest years on record are all in the recent past. All in the recent past. Almost every year is a new record for the warmest year in history. And that's not to say that it's always warmer everywhere 100% of the time. So like at one point, when we had this, God, it was like 2, 3, 4 winters back, we had this polar vortex where it was just like, there was, I remember my favorite meme around it was, one of those giant, like, 4-legged, like, battle things from Star Wars, from Hoth, with like the giant like storm filled with stormtroopers and like the lasers on the front. It's like somebody photoshopped that into like where it was like walking around the corner of some buildings in Chicago, and it's like that's what winter felt like. It was that bad. And but if you zoomed out and did a global like looked at a global heat map, it was that from the northeastern chunk of the US was like 10, 15, 20 degrees colder than normal. And the rest of the world, even while that is happening, the rest of the world is like 5 or 10 degrees hotter than normal for that time of year. So it's not just that everything is getting warmer, period. It's that stuff is getting weirder, stuff is getting less predictable, storms are getting stronger, weather patterns are changing and becoming unpredictable. So stuff like Hurricane Katrina is happening more and more. These once in a century storms are happening every few years. We have, but overall, the warming of the planet is going to be the biggest dominant thread and everything else that entails. Well, what happens when the planet warms? The ice caps melt, the oceans rise, we lose a lot of coastline. And the bad news is that we're going to lose a lot of useful land all around the world. Here's what this is going to look like in the United States. The blue parts are the parts that, inside that. So this outline here is the current outline of the United States. And the blue parts are where that disappears and becomes new water. So like New Orleans already, right? Florida, bye-bye. Bye-bye. San Diego, Los Angeles. Right. That's. This is New York City, Long Island. These pretty much all of the parts of the country that are up against the coast and aren't like San Francisco will be relatively okay because it's kind of like this big cliff right up against the water for most of the Bay Area. Although some of the inland stuff is going to get lost, as you can see. But imagine all of Florida going away. Think about what that means. Think about what that means and it'd be easy to make fun of Florida. I love to make fun of Florida, but I'm not going to here. Right? Think about what it means for New Orleans to go away. Think about what it means for like all of the inhabited parts of the Carolinas and Georgia to go away. Right? Think about what it means for New York City to go away. This is something like, I don't know, 20, 30% of the country's population lives in these areas that are going to disappear because of climate change. We're talking, even just within the United States, tens of millions of climate refugees. You think Denver real estate is bad now, right? Imagine when 20 million of your closest friends show up on the Front Range looking for a place to stay that's as high as far away from the ocean as possible. It's going to be, you think we have droughts now? You think we have a stressed ecosystem in Denver now? Like, this is not going to be pretty. This is not going to be pretty, and people are not going to. This is not going to be a comfortable scenario where we adjust real smoothly and everything turns out okay. This is going to be a real problem. And that's in the U.S., where these people, for the most part, are going to have, on a global scale at least, most of them are going to have a lot more resources than folks, say, in the favelas in Brazil, just inland in Argentina here, right? Where the folks in think about how many people live on the coast up here and up around here, and how few of them have real resources to deal with a problem like this. How many of them even have passports? How many of them have the money to pick up and get started somewhere else? we're going to be in real trouble here. We're going to be in real trouble. Look at we look at Australia, and it's like, yeah, Australia is going to lose a lot for sure, around the coast. And again, that's the coast is where all around the world, the coasts are where people live. But then like, think about all of the island nations around the world. Think about how many people live in places like this where, half of the country, where the whole country is going to disappear and where we're going to have all these climate refugees looking for new places to live. So when we talk about ESG stuff, when we talk about corporate social responsibility stuff, the single biggest issue for me, and I think this is true for anyone who's really studied this issue. I mean, I have different hobby horses. You can tell I'm interested in technology. I'm interested in diversity and inclusion stuff. I think those are important. Those are a tenth of a tenth of a tenth of a percent as important as what I'm talking to you about right now, which is nothing less than the fundamental defiling of our ability to make a comfortable living as a species on this planet. To say nothing of the other animals and all the plants and stuff where we're already seeing mass extinctions and so on. So I wanted to drill in on this and bring this home to a lot of you in ways that I don't think anything I'm saying here is really revelatory. I don't think anything I've said here today is. I've got some new stuff, which are some different concepts that bring in some of why we wind up in places like this. That will be new to you. I don't think anything I've said about global warming per se should be new to most of any of you. But what I want to do is hammer it home and make it really clear to you why you might, and you don't have to, I mean, it's your value system, but why you might think of this as something that's really important to you, and because you are the leaders of tomorrow. You really are the leaders of tomorrow who can have an impact on how this plays out, who can have an impact on how this plays out. I'm going to just bring it back closer to home just a little bit. And I want you to think about what your company can do to make this not happen. Right. You personally, as an individual, you can choose to drive a Tesla or roll coal in your truck or anywhere in between. You can have, solar panels on top of your roof and, recycle your water and, set up a complicated, expensive gray water system. And all of this stuff is great. But the impact that you as an individual are going to have on the environment, doing any of that versus all the conventional stuff, it's like very, 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 very small. But if you can nudge your company, a company with 1,000 employees, 10,000, 100,000 employees, to move just a little bit more towards a more sustainable solution, that's like hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people trading in, an F-350 for a Tesla. That's like tens of thousands of people trading in a standard power generated home in for a solar powered home. And that's where, if we get enough companies moving in that direction, then that can actually start to make enough of a meaningful difference that maybe we can save some of Florida. Maybe we can save more of Louisiana. Maybe Los Angeles can make it through. Maybe Manhattan doesn't have to go away. And that to me, not because, those places in particular matter to you, right? But because people live there. Good, honest, hardworking people live there, and we don't want our collective decisions as humans to chase them out of their homes and force them to become climate refugees. We don't want that. We don't want that in North America. We don't want that in South America. We don't want that all around the world. Right. So I hope, if you take nothing else away from this class, I hope you take away a passion to do what you think, not what I think, what you think is right, and can bring that into the boardrooms where you will eventually work. So how are we getting here? How are we getting here, and what are some of the relevant concepts? And this is where I think the book is a little bit. I mean, I talked about this a little bit in general. But I think the book is a little bit too rosy on a lot of counts. And here's one where I think the relevant concepts continue the sort of like, oh, Bill, it's a Monday already. Do you have to bring us down so far? It continues us on that trajectory to look at some of these relevant concepts until the end. And I have one that is actually relevant to this class that I think is a little bit of a potentially more of an upswing kind of concept. How do we get to this point? Well, the first is something called the principal agent problem. The principal agent problem. Let me define that very briefly for you, which is that, so the principal is somebody who has to live with the decision, and the agent is somebody who makes the decision. The principal is somebody who has to live with the decision, and the agent is somebody who has to make the decision. And anytime those are different people, you can have real problems. As illustrated by textbooks. Right? For every $400 textbook you've had to buy as a college student, there's I see one of you smirking, and I'm sorry that you've had to do this. I've tried to get as economical a solution as possible for you. I even considered the open source version of a book like this that I could find, the only one I could find. Do not recommend it. Not so good. I mean, I could probably give you some $20 and $30, $40 books to buy that collectively are still going to get you to about, something closer to $120. And that's not, this is shared with a lot of other classes, hopefully, for at least some of you. So this is actually probably still the most cost-effective way to give you a book that I think is good. But behind every $400 decision, a $400 textbook decision, is a professor who doesn't have to pay that $400. Right? The professor is the agent, and you are the principals. You have to go out and purchase that book. You have to live with that decision, even though you didn't make that decision to use the $400 book instead of the $100 book or a $50 book. And the ways that publishers get to that are various and sundry. There's a whole lot of different ways that publishers get professors to adopt these really expensive textbooks. They make stuff really easy for you. You see some of that on Cengage, right? Like the quizzes I didn't have to write and that I don't have to grade. That friendly team of people that are like, oh, you need to figure out how to integrate our thing with Canvas. Within a day, I email them and they're right on it because they absolutely want to keep me using Cengage books, right? So everything, the Bongo system that allows the peer reviews to work. I looked into doing that on Canvas. It's garbage. It does not work well. It's not fun. It's even worse to grade. So I was like, no, we'll use the Bongo because I know that because we have it, because it's part of the MindTap platform, because I as the agent made you, the principals, pay for the ability to make my job a little bit easier. Again, if the free book was good enough, I would do the rest of the work. I really would. But it is not. And in the environmental context, the agents who make these decisions are largely companies that make money, individuals too, right? But those are mostly structured by a combination of regulation and the market, who make these decisions about what energy they're going to use. But the principals are everybody around the whole world. So people who have never even seen a cell phone have to live with the decisions that we make based on that our society makes based on whether and how much fossil fuels we're going to burn. The decisions we make in 2021 are going to have an effect on people in 2121 and 2521. Right. So the principles of, future generations of people who've not benefited from our industrial societies, they all have to suffer those consequences every bit as much as you and I do. When it comes to future versus present, that mostly suffering more of those consequences than we do. So we have a principal agent problem in the environment, and that's a real problem. That helps contribute to, because it's not, if all of those costs, if the centuries in the future costs all told were actually paid by the people who burn fossil fuels, then we would burn a lot less of them. We'd burn a great deal less of them. We would all be driving. I mean, like we would all be living on top of each other in places. I mean, like I have a single family home with like a fifth of an acre of land. That wouldn't exist except for the very, very, very wealthiest people. We'd all be living in these, stacked up in, 30-story condo buildings as far as the eye can see, and taking buses up into the mountains for recreation instead of driving our Subarus. Another problem is a collective action failure. Collective action failure. It takes a team to cause most good things. It also takes a team to cause most bad things, right? And so, but in this case, the team that would be required to prevent climate catastrophe is basically all of the major companies and all of the world's major governments. And at both of those levels, right? If everyone but me, if every country but the US cuts their emissions, then the US benefits as much as everyone else. So why should we sacrifice for ourselves in a way where every sacrifice we make only benefits us just a little bit of that sacrifice? So every cut we make benefits us 2% and benefit 98% of that benefit goes to the rest of the world. Well, then why should Sweden make a cut where only 2% of the benefit of that cut benefits them and 98% benefits the rest of the world? Why should China make any cuts when only 2%, 2 or 3 or 4% of that cut benefits them and the other 95, 96, 97% benefits the rest of the world? So collectively, the acting collectively in a way that we're all better off is hard if every individual player can behave in a way such that they are better off in a way that those costs get borne by spread around to other people. So moving collectively in a way that is where any one person can sort of step out of that agreement, and any one company, any one country can step out of that agreement and still basically gain the benefits of the agreement, but not have to make the sacrifices, is tremendously difficult to execute. It's tremendously difficult to pull off. Another concept is regulatory capture. Now, I'm not saying that industries have the EPA locked in a cell. I just needed an image to capture the idea of capture. But think about all of the decisions that somebody like that an agency like the EPA has to make, and how incredibly technical and incredibly scientific those decisions are. Like, how many parts per million of mercury are okay in groundwater versus when do we have a problem? I have no idea. Somebody in my previous class looked it up and threw it in the chat, right? So, but other than that, I would have no idea, right? But you know who does? The EPA and their scientists, independent scientists who are generally going to be pretty busy, right? Running labs and, supervising grad students and that sort of thing. And industry scientists. And guess who's going to have the loudest voice in the room here? Right? I'm not going to drop it down to just that finger, but you get the idea. Right, the industry scientists are going to have the loudest voice in the room, and that's not just because they can throw a lot of expertise, throw a lot of money at the problem, but it's also because if the EPA doesn't do what industry wants, well, industry can just go to Congress and say, hey, that agency is not giving us what we need. They're not playing ball here. They're not negotiating with us in a way that recognize our needs and our interests. And so I think you should cut their funding, or I think you should, rein in their capacity to serve as actors. And so the elected representatives who oversee these agencies are another means by which industries can sort of force obeyance of the industry's needs upon these agencies. And so because so much of it happens behind the scenes, because so much of it happens far away from the public eye, or in a way, it's all public, but in a way that the public isn't going to pay attention. And even if they do, they're really mostly not going to understand. That sets these agencies up for failure. And that's often a lot of what we see. Now, the EPA has done okay. They actually have like a reasonably mixed to solid record on a lot of these things, like smog and mercury pollution and the carbon monoxide emissions and those sorts of things. Like, the EPA has actually done wonders in terms of making the immediate ecology a lot safer than it was before the act that created the EPA got passed. So it's not. I don't want to imply that the EPA is completely locked away and the key has been thrown away. That is not the case. But that there are a lot of steps between protect the environment and the regulators actually doing that, and those steps in between are sort of laid with traps, a lot of which can sort of push the regulator off to the side to where they feel like they can't really act. I said I had a good one, a cheery one, a good news one. And that one is actually really kind of at the heart of this class, which is corporate identity. Right? In rooms like this, all around corporate America, there are people such as yourselves with college degrees, largely business majors, who sit around and say, okay, but if we do the wrong thing, won't that make us look bad? And if we do the right thing, won't that make us look good? If we do the wrong thing, won't that make us look bad? And if we do the right thing, won't that make us look good? And that push to look at the corporate identity as contingent upon at least reasonably responsible corporate behavior by members of companies who are in the rooms making these decisions is a trend that has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger over time. So surveys show that folks in your generation, for the most part, I mean, I know we have an age diverse group here, and some of you are probably more like my age, but for the most part, most of you are a lot younger than me. And the surveys show that folks your age are even more interested than folks my age, who are much more interested than folks our parents' age, in doing the right thing at work, feeling like you're doing the right thing at work. And so that corporate identity as a way to draw talent, to bring in employees who can add value to the operation, who can contribute successfully to a successful bottom line, is in some respects, to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree, contingent upon that corporate identity being associated with being a company that at least tries to do the right thing. And companies are hungry for talent, right? The buildings, the machinery, whatever, the infrastructure, all of that stuff is nice. But the bulk of value for most companies goes home every night at 6 o'clock. The bulk of real value for most companies goes home every night at some point. And so if we can bring you in by convincing you that we're doing the right thing, we're going to get better talent, and that's important, and that's really important to companies having productivity, having success, having innovation. There's also clients and customers. Clients and customers increasingly are focused on working with companies that are doing the right thing. When I was a kid, nobody talked smack about Walmart. Walmart was a much worse company than they are right now, actually, in terms of like the way that they treat their suppliers and the way they treat their employees. They've got a lot better about treating their suppliers as a little bit more as partners and a little bit less as serfs on Walmart's farm. There's still something to that relationship, the nature of that relationship that's problematic, but it's better than it used to be. And the way they treat their employees is substantially better. Right, and as well as they've actually had as a lot of you have noted in your papers, have actually had probably a meaningful effect in terms of improving the environmental efficiency of a lot of their supply chains. Right, and none of that, they didn't have to do any of that when I was a kid. They didn't have to do any of that when I was a kid because nobody cared, and now people care. People just care a lot, and I don't want to say nobody, but almost nobody. Very few people cared, and now the majority of people at least kind of have some ear to the ground about this stuff and some care about what that looks like. So corporate identity for employees, corporate identity for suppliers, for clients, for all of the different other sort of, is this a company that I want to do business with, is increasingly an ethical question. And so that corporate identity is a factor that's something that's having an effect on whether people on company behavior in a real and meaningful way. Told you there was a little good news. Back to some bad news. The last concept I want to talk about is greenwashing. This should be a little more familiar to you, but I just want to hammer it home, which is the idea that companies engage in, because corporate identity is an important part of what drives companies to behave better. How about if we just make it look like we're behaving well, such as how we treat the environment in such a way that helps our corporate identity, but that actually doesn't change anything. So that actually also is a real problem and can be a real problem in corporate America. And I'm going to start a podcast today at the Planet Money podcast. It illustrates my favorite example of greenwashing, just because it illustrates so clearly how a lot of this stuff works.